Hear the word of the Lord from Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 to 18. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have engaged in sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose prostitution the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk." So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her prostitution, and on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of horrors and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. But the angel said to me, "Why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come." This calls for a mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Also, there are 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are united in yielding their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, "The waters that you saw, where the whore is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the whore. They will make her desolate and naked. They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by agreeing to give their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman you saw is a great city that rules over the kings of the earth." This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. It's really actually quite exciting for me to be with you. I've been doing church a lot for my whole life, and it's always a great joy to be at one that I've never been in before, be in a space I've never been in, meet people that I've never had a chance to meet. And so I do hope, I've met a number of you before the church service. I hope to meet a number of you after the church service, and I do bring greetings from the East Bay, particularly Lafayette Orinda Presbyterian Church, which is where my wife is a pastor and my kids sort of have their whole childhood life in church. And so she wanted to be here today as well, but she's busy because of it's same time the service, other things. But so I've been praying all week, actually, that as somebody who speaks for a living, I teach most of my life, and I recognize that nothing I say matters unless it's something you hear. And so my hope, my prayer all week has been I would say something in the course of the 30 or so minutes I get to talk that would mean something to you. And I hope that that's a prayer that you have as well. I also do need to say here at the beginning that I've been listened to, given quite a few, but listened to many thousands of sermons in my lifetime, and I've never, ever in my 50 years encountered somebody preaching on Revelation 17. So this is a first. I've taught about it, but I've never stood up in front of a church and heard, God bless you, man, for saying the word whore in front of the church like that. Like, that's just not something I've ever done and plan to ever do again in my life, probably. But there's a lot in this chapter, in chapter 17. And so what I would like us to do together really is to focus our attention on two things, and I hope they'll be useful to you. The first one, I do want to spend just a little bit of time trying to unpack some of the symbolism. There's so much symbolism in the book. Have you felt like that for the course? It's chock full. In fact, and it's usually layers upon layers upon layers. What I'd like to do is to try to highlight just a couple, a very small number of key symbols in the book that I hope that you'll be able to really grasp and recognize what the sort of the essential thing that's being portrayed in chapter 17 is. And then I want to turn, after maybe 10 minutes or so of doing that, and spend the last part talking about our message, which thankfully, in contrast to the symbolism, which is quite complex, is actually, I want to argue, really, really simple. It doesn't mean it's not profound. I think it's actually quite profound and quite challenging, but it's at the same time really simple. In fact, if all I was going to do is the last thing and you wanted me to be out of here really quickly, we could be done in about 35 seconds. But we'll unpack it a little bit along the way. And so I do want to start with the symbolism because one of the challenges of the book of Revelation is that sometimes it's hard to figure out the message because you just get stuck and trip all over the symbolism. So let's start with a bit of this. And I know you've had mention, I had a chance, boy, you record all these sermons. I got a chance to watch a bunch of them, parts of others. I know you've talked a little bit about the city, the idea of empire, which we'll come back to. But I wanted to just unpack a little bit more about this idea of the unfaithful city, because that's what you're encountering in chapter 17. It's something that's been mentioned a lot of times in your first 16 chapters of the book of Revelation, but here in chapter 17, they just stop. And then the whole thing's about this one concept, this unfaithful city. And I want to take those two terms, city, and the word is prostitution here. The word in your translation is whore. Other translations try to be a little more circumspect and say something like harlot, which no one says anymore. But what are we talking about when we talk about an unfaithful city? Right? And so let's start with the city. The word here is polis, which is where you get the word police and politics and a whole bunch of other things. And the important thing about a city or a polis is that it's not a place. I'm going to say that again. It's not a place. It's not a location. It's not the city limits of San Francisco and everything that happens inside the city limits of San Francisco and not the things outside it. It's actually a community of persons with shared values. And so in a very real sense, this church is a polis. This church is a city. You are a community of persons that have intentionally come together, not because you couldn't figure out where else to be on a Sunday morning, but my guess is because you share certain ideals, certain goals, certain values, certain things you're trying to work towards. You're committed to each other. You have a culture. You have a society. This is what we're talking about when we talk about a city. And so I would call a church a city in an important sense of polis. I don't know if I would call an apartment complex a city. Because I don't know, actually, 97% of the people that are actually in the apartment complex with me. I maybe say hi to them when I pick up the mail, but it's not the same thing. So when we talk about an unfaithful city, notice that we're not talking about geography, we're not talking about place, we're talking about a group of people, and a group of people that share some sort of culture, some sort of values in common. And that's what the emphasis is here. The second thing that we need to just say is that prostitution, the Greek word is porne, it's where we get the word pornography from. It also means, you could translate again, harlotry, whoredom, all kinds of other fun ways of translating this particular word. It's a very common term that you've encountered from the Old Testament a whole lot of times. At the bottom, I mentioned the book Hosea, which is probably the most famous example of it in the Old Testament. But prostitution doesn't mean sexual immorality here. This is not saying sexual immorality is not important. It actually is quite important. It's one of the ways that we live out our lives and our relationships with other people, and so what we do with it matters a lot. But when we talk about prostitution in the context of the unfaithful city, we're talking about infidelity to God. right? And the two things that in the prophets and in the book of Revelation that they're concerned with in terms of infidelity, which is idolatry, worshiping that which is not God, and injustice, treating our neighbors in ways that don't align with the values of God. Right? And so when we're talking about an unfaithful city, we're not talking about a space of geography that comes in, has a whole lot of prostitutes standing on the street corner. What we're talking about is a community that's engaged in idolatry and injustice. And that's Babylon. That's what we're encountering here. Now, obviously, prostitution is a symbol, a term that's got a whole lot of neon flashing qualities to it. It gets your attention, and the book of Revelation likes to do that a lot. The second thing that I want to just mention to you, again, we could probably spend not just 30 minutes, but about 16 hours going through every single symbol in this chapter. But I want to highlight one other really, really key important part of this symbol. And Pastor Al's done a good job to you talking about that although when the book of Revelation is written, its concern is Rome, because that's the big empire on the block at the time, its actually concern is much bigger than Rome. Rome is just the current incarnation of a pattern of human history, a kind of community in human history that's devoted to idolatry and injustice that repeats. And if you don't know your Old Testament prophets inside and out, you're probably going to miss a lot of these references. In fact, I picked 4, but there's probably 40 in this chapter. But there's a constant refrain in Old Testament text pointing to that idolatrous city, that unfaithful city, this unfaithful city. And a lot of the images, the symbols that are going on with our city Babylon here are actually drawn from some of these really famous passages. And so if you go to Nahum chapter 3, again, I don't know how many people preach on Nahum ever, but it's actually fascinating. It's a book written at the time when Israel was suffering under the Assyrian Empire. Right, this is in the same area as Babylon, but before Babylon in modern-day Iraq. And the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and it was a bloody, brutal, bloodthirsty empire, was Nineveh. Right, if you're into archaeology, it's actually a famous place to go. Do archaeology is in Nineveh still today. But chapter 3 is a condemnation, a glorying in the coming fall of Nineveh. A city of bloodshed, a city of deceit. And actually, our chapter 17 is pulling some phrases, some images out of what Nineveh was like to describe this city. And then when we turn to Jeremiah 51, we encounter the actual Babylon, which had fallen long, long before the Roman Empire. But again, a successor empire to Assyria in what is modern-day Iraq. And then the city built on the waters, that's actually a literal description of Babylon. It's a city built on irrigation. Coming out of the Tigris and the Euphrates. But it's also described in chapter 51 as a city that's holding a golden cup by which it makes drunk the nations of the earth. And you heard that phrase here, right, in this chapter 17. Perhaps a city that is less familiar, but a capital of mercantilism, of shipping, of commerce. North of Israel was a city called Tyre. And in the 23rd chapter of Isaiah, it's described as a city that prostitutes itself with the kings of the earth. And then what I wanted to highlight here is just a couple of really strong examples of this general phenomenon, because we're going to see how it's going to incorporate Rome too. But it's not Rome specifically. It's Rome as part of this pattern. And all the pieces of that pattern for many, many centuries are actually getting woven together in this chapter. To talk about Rome, but I think the beauty of doing a sermon series like this here that you've been discovering over the course of the last several months is that things that John was concerned about in the book of Revelation are things that are still present in the world today. And so Rome is not a major threat in the world today. Tyre is definitely not a major threat in the world today. Nineveh, again, unless you're really interested in archaeology, is probably not something you're worried about. But the pattern is here. And the last part of the pattern, the thing that actually John will incorporate a lot of, is not from biblical text, but from imagery or symbolism about Rome. And probably the most famous piece is that Rome is the city built on 7 hills. If you actually go to Rome, you can stand up at a high point and they can point out to you the 7 hills. Very early on in Rome's history, it became part of its iconography. And I wanted to show you a coin, because coins are fun. But this is an emperor named Vespasian, who you may have heard of before. He was Nero, you've all heard of. Nero died in 68 by suicide. as the empire revolted against him and his corrupt rule. And then there were actually 4 emperors in sequence, all within a year. It was a year of civil wars in Rome. And Vespasian is the one that puts that down and restabilizes the empire, makes it a calm place again. And one of the things he did, because he's like Romans in general, really good at PR, is he started issuing money saying how great I am for having done this. And so on the left side, you have his face, because this is Vespasian. But on the right side, and I hope you can see it from where you sit, do you see that it's a woman who is reclined as queen on a throne? And she's holding in her hands actually a very common symbol of Roman royal authority. It was a special kind of dagger that had a very wide blade. And below her, on her bottom, right under her bottom, you see the wolf with the 2 children suckling at it, the Romulus and Remus. And actually to her right, you see the river Tiber, which is where Rome is built. But what she's actually sitting on that's her throne is 7 hills. And no one who would have ever encountered anything, and you said, this is 7 hills, everybody in the empire would have said, well, that's Rome. So Rome is part of this story that he's trying to tell, but it's also Nineveh that's part of the story. It's also Babylon that's part of the story. It's also Tyre that's part of the story. It's also a lot of things that are around today that are part of this story. So that's just a little bit of the symbolism. Again, we could spend many, many, many hours on the symbolism, but I wanted to highlight those things so that we could begin to understand the nature of this unfaithful city who is drawn, the imagery is drawn from all kinds of cities, both before and after the time of John. And if we were to do it today, I would be interested in what we would want to add to the mix. But I want to spend most of the time, if that's okay, on the message. And I do want to invite, if after that time you want to say, well, what about verse whatever? You didn't mention that. We can mention that, but it'll be after the sermon when everybody else gets to go get coffee and not participate anymore if they don't want to. And so I think the message is pretty simple, and I want to deal with it in a couple of parts. The first part, and you see it a number of times in this chapter, but you've already seen it in the book of Revelation, is this notion that John is presenting that evil amazes us. And that's maybe shocking, because we might also say, well, evil frightens us, evil makes us angry. But actually, as John presents evil in this book, it's consistent that evil is amazing. That is, it leaves people awed when they see it. We saw this back in chapter 13. I had a chance to watch the sermon given a couple weeks ago, about chapter 13. But when you met the beast from the sea, but the line that actually appears right after the beast rises from the sea, it says, in amazement, the whole earth followed the beast, and they worshipped the beast. And then the 2 questions they ask tell you why. They're amazed. They worship the beast because they say, who is like the beast? This thing is so much bigger, so much greater than anything I've ever encountered, I've ever seen. It overwhelms me with its capacity, with its power, with its accomplishments. And even if it might seem a little bit questionable, who can fight against that? Right? And that's a profound moment where you see what John has talked about over and over again in the book, which is people following the beast. But you recognize they're not following it because they're getting on the bandwagon of evil. They're following it because they're amazed by what they're encountering. And when we see here in chapter 17, that theme continues. So I picked a couple parts out, because part of the interesting and really the important part of Revelation 17 is, I don't know do you remember that Michael Jackson video, 30 years ago or something like that, where he was singing and then his face got blended into somebody else's face, and they were singing and they got blended into somebody else? The Revelation 17 did that long before Michael Jackson. That's what's happening here in this chapter. But we have to see the part 1 and part 2 in order to understand what's happening. So I picked out part 1 here. And it says, this is John speaking. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, and it had 7 heads, and later on it tells you the 7 heads are the 7 mountains or the 7 hills. So again, clearly some symbolism from Rome. It says the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet. Well, I know you can go to Kohl's or Amazon or whatever and buy something in purple and scarlet, and it's okay. But actually in the Roman Empire, purple and scarlet was what you wore when you were royalty. It was actually so expensive, the dye, for purple and scarlet. It was not within the capacity for anybody except for the most wealthy, most powerful people to wear it, with one exception, which I'll tell you in just a second. In fact, there were laws in the Roman Empire that prevented people. You weren't allowed to wear purple or scarlet unless you were of a certain social class, right? And so she's being presented as this royal woman. And she's adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. And she's holding in her hand a golden cup. And I want you to stop, just those images. How does she look? She's regal, royal. She's, that image on the coin, the backside of the coin that I showed you, it's called the goddess Roma. That's actually, it's a representation of the city in sort of goddess form. But she is something to be looked up to, something to be emulated. She's the great matron, right? That we look up to, the wise woman that tells us how to live our lives. And when John saw her, do you notice what happened? He was greatly amazed. John, who's been doing all this crazy stuff that you've been encountering for like 4 or 5 months now? It's a really long time to spend on them. Good for you. But John is greatly amazed. Maybe she's powerful and we can't imagine a fight, but she's just beautiful. She looks good. And in a society, when people look good, we sort of assume good things about them. Maybe say we don't want to do that, but have you ever watched what happens in a restaurant? When somebody walks in and they look good, they don't have to stand in line. They go right to the front. Now, if you're wearing a ratty t-shirt, you just came from the gym, you can stand in line. She looks good. In fact, it says in chapter 17, I'm not going to give you all the quotes, but a bunch of times it said people were amazed, people were amazed. Now notice the angel right after this says to John, why are you amazed? Because we're getting ready to get that transition that happens. But I wanted to give you a quote that's not from the book of Revelation, but actually I think is probably the simplest one-line statement of this theme that you encounter. It comes from Paul, though, in the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, when Paul says that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Right? And it's super important for understanding the book of Revelation and perhaps some of the larger truths that the book of Revelation is trying to point us to, that evil doesn't look like evil. That's really important. So if it doesn't look like what it is, you know what we need? You need somebody to pull away the curtain and show you what it really is. And actually, and again, I know going back to that very first sermon, there's some definitions, but our word apocalypse, which is our same, in Greek, it was our same word in Latin, revelation, which is actually just the word in English to unveil. And it actually is most common in the ancient world in weddings. Because you know what the bride wore? A veil. So you have really no idea what she looked like. But you know what happens after you marry her? You pull back the veil or pull up the veil, right? You get to see what, now you sort of know what she looks like because, you know, there's got to be a nose in there somewhere, right? But, by the way, this is one of my favorite films. I don't know if you ever, if you haven't never seen The Wizard of Oz, I hope you will. But this is the scene where the giant flaming head that's been scaring them all the time they've returned with a witch's broom. It's still telling them that it's not going to help them. And then our little dog, who you might be able to see right at the bottom of the curtain, named Toto, has pulled the curtain away. And it turns out the giant head is just an old white dude from Nebraska. Right? Things aren't always what they seem. So the word here is unveiling, or we might use in more common English parlance, unmasking. And so the question that was asked in chapter 13, which I think is going to help us to understand the question in chapter 17, is who is like the beast? God is like the beast, and the beast is like God. Intentionally so. There's a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit that's very important, obviously, in Christian theology, but also in the book of Revelation. Magically, there happen to be 3 things. There's the dragon, the beast from the sea, and the beast from the land that you've met. I don't know if you noticed in the course of your many, many sermons and time reading the book of Revelation, but one of the most common phrases that's used for God and Jesus in the book of Revelation is he's the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Right? I don't know if you noticed here in chapter 17, but it's happened a number of times that the beast is the one who was and is not and is to come. There's a whole story, and it's not this sermon, but about sort of the story of Nero dying and perhaps coming back to life that's current at the time. If you paid any attention, there's a whole lot of sevens on God's side. There's 7 horns, there's 7 stars, there's 7 lampstands. We could just keep going because they like the number 7. But you know what? There were a whole lot of 7s on the beast side too. Right? There were 7 heads, there's 7 diadems. Both lead to worship. What John considers true worship, what the book of Revelation calls false worship, and they both create a city. And so you've already met the faithful city in Revelation 12. She's fleeing from the dragon into the wilderness. You got that sermon a couple weeks ago. Pretty soon you'll meet another faithful city, the New Jerusalem, who's coming down as the bride of Jesus in chapter 21. And here in 17 you meet the unfaithful city. Right? So who is like the beast? You know what the beast is trying to do? It's trying to look like an angel of light. Revelation's very, very concerned. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment. But it's very concerned with the fact that things that are truly wrong and destructive appear truly good and life-giving until you look one more time. So we have to, in that light, we have to unmask her, this unfaithful city. And so the passages to the left, the one we just looked at, right? She's a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. By the way, this is supposed to be like a horse. This would have also been a typical part of the imagery. And she's got, again, the purple, the scarlet, the gold, the jewels, the pearls. She's got her golden cup. John is amazed. And then the angel says, "Why are you amazed?" and starts showing John what this woman is like. And she starts with the cup. What's in the cup? Well, the cup is not full with wine, which is what you would expect. It's instead full of abominations and the impurities of fornication, which is a really offensive way of saying sort of the dregs of blood and sex and a whole bunch of other things. But it's disgusting. But it's disgusting inside a golden cup. Right? Jesus has a line about the whitewashed tombs at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. You may have encountered it before, but all right. I told you before that royalty wore purple, but there's actually one other group of people in Rome that were allowed to wear purple, and that was high-class prostitutes. And you know what the high-class prostitutes had? Is that they wore a headband on their head, had their name written across it. And so suddenly when you look closer at this matron, what's she wearing? Something on her forehead that's got her name on it. And again, John's audience knows, like, this is a prostitute we're looking at, but it's not just a prostitute, it's the prostitute. Right? And she's drunk. By the way, good wine, you sip. She's roaringly drunk with the blood of the saints. And as it goes into the end of chapter 14, you discover it's not just the saints, and of all who have been slaughtered on earth. This is not just Rome. This is a system. This is a way of living. This is a way of being in the world. Right? This is a bit like, just to do a very brief modern analogy, if somebody had a picture of our version of the matronly woman. You know what our version is in the United States? It's the Statue of Liberty. Right? The French do this too. There's all kinds of Lady Liberty stuff that you get. But they gave us the Statue of Liberty, so we get it. Right? But if somebody did that and did one of your Michael Jackson fade in and out kind of things, and you got really, really close, and she had vampire teeth that were dripping blood, and all of a sudden, it was like, oh, wait, she's not what I thought she appeared to be. Make sense? So, what does this mean about evil? A couple of things. One, and it's much more than this sermon, but I think it's a profoundly important point that theologians have made for a long time. That evil is not an independent reality. There isn't good and evil, and both have just been hanging around for a while. That evil is actually a corruption of the only thing that exists. And the only thing that exists is good. God is the creator of all things that exist, and those things are good. Remember, we go through the first chapter of Genesis, right? God says it's good, and by the time we get to the sixth day and we're finishing everything, everything's very good. And yet that we know when we look at the world, like, we're messing up, like, a lot, right? And so, but what is that? What is that thing that we encounter when we see injustice, when we see corruption, when we see evil? Well, it's not some independent thing that we call evil, but it's a corruption of the good. And that's why it can look so much like it. Right? And so what does that mean about temptation? Well, it means that temptation, at least for most people, I struggle to speak in universals because somebody can probably always give me a counterexample, but most people I've ever known, ever encountered, ever read in my life are not saying, oh, I'm so tempted to do some evil. Right? When you're tempted, it looks good. Whether it's a brownie you know you're not supposed to eat, marital infidelity, or cheating a little bit on your taxes, or supporting a system, being part of a community that seems to be fighting something that seems to be bad, or looking at something, or defending something that seems to be good, but really it's not when we look a little more deeply. So we're not tempted to do evil, we're tempted to do good, but it's not good, capital G. It's some lesser good that's a piece that's hanging out of God's creation, but we've forgotten about God in that process. But what does that mean when we encounter people that are committing things that we would call evil? We have to recognize that, again, maybe not all of them. There's got to be some unique people out there. But most people that are doing this, and the famous writer Hannah Arendt talked about this as the banality of evil when she was writing about World War II and all the massacres that happened there. But most what we would call evil is actually committed by people who are convinced that they're doing the right thing. Now, they may have convinced themselves like that, their society may have convinced them, but they don't walk around saying, yay, evil, I'm championing evil. They think they're doing something good, something just, something necessary. And so I tried to come up with my list of people I would say that I can't imagine many people would be like, would try to defend something good they did. So I picked Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and the Confederacy, because I had to come up with one in the United States. Right? But if you've ever read anybody that was involved in the projects that were led by Stalin or Hitler or Mao or the Confederacy, they all thought they were protecting a good group of people from an evil group of people. Or they were defending God's society against some sort of invasion from something else that was evil, right? And so they were willing to be horrific in order to do what they saw was good. So as we kind of wrap up the last 3 or 4 minutes here, when we see those injustices in the world, one of the things that, if you go back to the opening sermons about the letters, which I love that you did them one at a time, because that's actually the most important part of the book of Revelation, you encounter in those really what I would call 3 relationships to injustice. And by the way, I see some of you taking pictures. I'm happy to share the slides if that's you can have that. No property values here. But a lot of people, when they read the book of Revelation, focus only on the first one. They say, oh, the book of Revelation is written for people who are the victims of the injustice. They're therefore the objects of the violence, the objects of the discrimination, the objects. And we get some of that in the book. In fact, the churches of Smyrna and Philadelphia that you encountered at the beginning of the book actually are churches that are being persecuted, right? And when you read the book of Revelation, it's written to those churches, and so it provides hope. It says this will not last forever. There will be a downfall. If you read the end of chapter 17, Babylon is actually quite literally eaten by the rest of the beast, right? She dissolves in the violence that she's taking part of. But what I want to highlight for you here is that although 2 of our 7 churches at the beginning of the book are victims of injustice, the other 5 are not. And the Revelation's written to them too. And the other 5 really fall into 2 other categories. I would call them complacent. That is, they feel themselves disconnected from the injustice. It doesn't affect them, it doesn't bother them, it doesn't hurt them, and so they're just there. And so the churches of Ephesus, Pergamum, and Thyatira, you can go watch all those sermons back again later on, are not, they don't see a problem with Babylon. It has nothing to do with me. And that curtain has to be pulled back so you recognize, no, there actually is a problem here. But there's even a higher level of the difficulty, and that's the churches of Sardis and Laodicea at the beginning aren't just complacent about the injustice, but they're actually actively supporting it or prospering from it in some capacity. Right? And so part of what's happening in chapter 17 is God is saying to Smyrna and Philadelphia, don't worry, this will end. But part of what's happening in chapter 17 is God is saying to Ephesus and Pergamum and Thyatira and Sardis and Laodicea is, look who you're making your bed with. And so two things here. One is discernment. I picked a passage from 1 John 4:1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God. I could have picked chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians where God lists the discernment of spirits as one of the gifts of the Spirit. But discernment is looking carefully and sorting things one from another. Don't believe all the PR. Don't believe what they tell. Rome had an amazing PR machine. I don't know if you know what the motto of the Roman Empire was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. They said, they're everywhere we go, we bring peace. And in one sense, that was true. You could actually get on a road in the Roman Empire and walk to another city in the Roman Empire on that road and not really worry about a whole lot of bandits or anything because they killed them all, right? But there was a famous British general once gave a speech during the Roman Empire, and he said, there's so much peace because everybody's dead. Discernment. And then the second thing, once you've done the discernment, and this comes at the very beginning of chapter 18, so a little beyond our passage today, but the angel turns to John after he showed him all this, and he says, then I heard another voice from the heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins, so that you do not share in her plagues. And he's not talking about a space. Because remember, city isn't a space, it's not a place. In what way are you part of a group, a community? Are you complacent? Maybe you're a victim of, but maybe you're complacent, maybe you're accommodating. And so we'll end with the questions, and then I know I'm very conscious of how hard it is to listen to a sermon, so I apologize. I think I went over a couple minutes. But 3 questions to walk away with. 1, where do we encounter forces of injustice? Political, economic, personal, etc., that make themselves appear to be good in your world? Where might you practice discernment? Where do you see things that make themselves appear to be worthy of respect? Or you're told that you should emulate them. Maybe that you should even worship them, which again means to put them as the central value in your life, the ultimate reference point for you. But when you look closely, you discover that's not what they really are. In what ways do we tell ourselves that it's okay to ignore injustices, the complacency problem, or to share in the goods that they produce, the accommodation problem? And then, once we've done the discernment, just a question that I ask myself every day. How do we come out of systems that are rivals to God in our world? And I don't have an answer to that question. That's the challenge that I live with, and I think in a world in which good and evil actually look really similar a lot of the time, and especially when we want it to be good, because it helps us in some capacity. My prayer for myself, my prayer for you, is that discernment and the ability to come out would be part of your lives and this church. Thank you. Amen.